Hello ghosts and ghouls, and welcome to another episode of Danica Raven's Bitesize Horror. This week's episode is about the dangers of a beautiful woman. This week's story is Desire by R.T.Gillespie. If you're sitting comfortably, we shall begin. I can hear the end approaching. It's clawing its way along the corridors of my shame. I am spending my final moments writing down my story as a warning to anyone that might find it. But I don't know what good it will do. Humans are weak, and I'm a prime example of the depths we sink to achieve even the most momentary pleasures and fleeting material gain. It all began on that ruinous night on a gaslit street many years ago. Whatever possessed me to take that deserted street, a diversion from my usual haunts, eludes me until it was entirely too late. I was compelled by my basest desires to seek something. I knew not what. Then out of the darkness she appeared before me with her dreadful beauty. With my last vestige of common sense, I tried to cross the street, turn and run. Anything but get close to her. From the first, I sensed something unnatural about her. Something that repelled my basest instincts. But her physical allure was such that there was no chance of me to resist the temptation she so willingly laid out before me. In the golden glow from a dimming gas light, she seduced me in an instant with a not but a look. She boldly wrapped her arms around my neck, and I didn't resist. I let her pull me down to her level. "Have your way with me, and I will give you anything you desire," she whispered to me. Under her gaze, all I desired was her. But I managed to speak what I thought was the truth, even if only for one brief second that night. "I desire power," I gasped in my all-consuming lust for her. I was shocked at the lack of control I had over myself. A woman of such beauty would usually have paralysed me with fear. That was my second clue that something was wrong. I should have turned and fled, but I didn't have control over my body anymore. I couldn't keep my eyes off her impossibly red lips. My memories of that first night are fragmented. I couldn't tell if we were in some lavish hotel or private mansion, but I found myself in a room sumptuously furnished in reds and gold, but also in black. Or was that just deep shadows? At moments I felt like I was trapped in a prison of darkness, furnished with blood. But then she would turn her attention on me once again, and those thoughts fled. Such pleasures of the flesh she showed me that night that all others since have paled in comparison. When the morning came, I found myself not in the luxurious room that I'd fallen asleep in, but in a run-down hotel. I was alone, and there was no sign anyone else had been there with me. I begged the proprietor to tell me which way she had gone, but he assured me that I had arrived alone yesterday evening. I left the place determined that one day I would find her again. I should note that when I said I desired power, it was a fleeting moment of weakness, and I wasn't exactly sure what I meant. If I had known what was to happen, I would have said something else, or maybe nothing at all. Better I had bit off my own tongue. Once I found myself back on a familiar street, my hazy memory began to clear, although where I'd come from I couldn't recall. All I knew was that I was going to be late for work, but I found I no longer cared. I no longer cared to work under a cruel man who thought only of himself. It seemed so wasteful that I went straight there and resigned. Never before had I felt so empowered. Then I returned home to the news that my grandfather had died that morning while I was at work having what seemed now to be a selfish and petty fight with my boss. At the time, it didn't seem unusual. He was old, but up until then he'd had perfect health. The coroner couldn't tell what the cause of death was and just put it down to old age. I didn't find out until years later that he had died with a look of terror on his face. I inherited a sizable amount of money that I never realised that my grandfather had amassed. The rest of the family had seemed surprised at the time, even my grandmother. The money was accompanied by a scrawled note which simply said, "Money is power." This wasn't a sentiment I'd ever sensed my grandfather to have, but at the moment it made perfect sense to me. It planted the seed. I felt better than ever, and now I had the money to do anything I wanted. All thoughts of the woman from the night before fled my mind. Surely she'd just been a cruel hallucination. The next day I returned to my old job, bought it outright and fired my old taskmaster. For a year I ran that company ruthlessly, and by the end of the year it was one of the most profitable in the city. But still, I desired more. That was when she returned to me again. For a year I had searched for her with no luck. I'd hired countless private detectives to hunt her down, or to hunt down that luxurious house that I was certain we'd spent the night in. A memory had returned to me of an open window, the sound of nature, the smell of the countryside coming from beyond, although no such place seemed to exist for miles around. I was walking home alone that night, contemplating a business deal that I was trying to secure, when she appeared before me again. She slipped out of the darkness as if she'd been birthed from it. "Where have you been? I've missed you so much," she breathed huskily into my ear, those luscious red lips brushing my skin, inflaming my desire. Her words were strange, since she was the one that had abandoned me, but at that moment I didn't care. I was overjoyed to see her again, and my common sense was addled by my lust for her. She looked even more sensual than before, if that was even possible. "I've been here, my love. Why did you disappear?" I said, like a foolish, love-struck teenager. "Don't worry about that. I'm here now," she said, and taking my hand, led me into the darkness. Once again, I was treated to such a night of pleasures, such otherworldly delights, that I was made numb to the touch of any other. We returned to that same red, gold and black lavish room. I tried my hardest to be more attentive of my surroundings this time, tried to stay awake when an overwhelming need to sleep washed over me. If I could just see out the window, I could perhaps determine the location. But she kept tight hold of me and pulled me down to her breast. "Sleep, my love," she said, and within a minute I fell into the deepest sleep I think to this day that I've ever had. I awoke, to my eternal regret, to find myself in my own house, in my own bed, alone once again. A feel of utter despondency washed over me. After a year I'd finally found her, but yet again she'd disappeared. I laid in bed for hours, until an incessant knocking at my door forced me from my bed. It was a telegram. A rival company had relented and agreed to my takeover. The feelings of gloom left me, and I found myself on top of the world again. Never had I expected to have such business acumen. Suddenly, I was worth twice as much as I had been the day before. On the spot, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I was no longer comfortable or happy in my own home. Never again did I want to awake there alone. I decided to build the house of my dreams, the house with the red, gold and black room where the two best nights of my life had occurred. A few months after my grandfather, my grandmother died of a broken heart, although some said she was going crazy in her old age. She had raved of nerve-shredding shrieks and fluttering of great leathery wings on the night that my grandfather had died. Everyone tried to convince her that they were just dreams, but she stuck to her story until the end. A few weeks into the build, my business growing in leaps and bounds, the unthinkable happened. My mother was found dead with a look of absolute terror carved on her face. I knew I should have done something, but I was numb. Instead, I threw myself into the construction of the house of my dreams, the only thing in this world that could now bring me happiness. I pushed my workers to their limit, as well as myself. I attended the funeral, closed casket of course, and went straight back to work. I stayed in hotels throughout the entire build, having sold my house the day after my last dalliance with my mysterious lover. Throughout the whole process, I kept strict control over the design of that one red room, making sure it was perfect, down to the smallest detail. When it was finally complete, I could barely believe it. What had felt like nothing but a dream before was finally a reality, and I went to sleep happy for the first time in a long while. Despite a full staff looking after the place every hour of the day, she still managed to slip past them. I awoke as she slipped beneath my covers, as naked as the day she was born. Instead of accosting her, as I should have, I welcomed her with open arms, and we spent the night in silence, blissfully happy in each other's company. As the cruel morning light shone through the windows, I once again expected to wake up to find myself abandoned. But imagine my joy at finding her still cradled beside me, her golden hair spread out on the regal bedsheet like an angel's halo. That day was the beginning of the end. I expected her to disappear into thin air at any second, so I kept her in my sight all day. I didn't have anything to worry about though. As soon as she woke, she refused to leave my side, like a clingy newlywed. She tried dragging me back to bed, but I had a lot of work to catch up on. I was beginning to understand why my old boss had been so cruel. There wasn't enough time in the day to do everything, and always there was distractions, although mine were more enjoyable than most. "Are you bored of me already?" she whimpered with downcast eyes. It was like a fist had grabbed hold of my heart and was squeezing the life out of me. I couldn't bear to see an ounce of sadness in her. "Of course not, my love, but I need to finalise this paperwork," I pleaded with her. I'd already delayed it long enough. Very slowly and deliberately, she removed her clothes, one layer at a time. It took all my concentration to continue working. I was being honest when I'd said the paperwork needed doing. I wasn't the kind of man to put business before pleasure, but in this case, I would be facing ruin if I ignored the paperwork, in more ways than one. But I didn't realise at the time. When she'd removed the last flimsy layer of lace, she draped her body provocatively around me and whispered in my ear again, with that husky voice that commanded so much power over me. The exact words she used are too much for me to repeat here. My shame is great enough without the thought of others thinking me devoid of all decency. What I can tell you is that she promised me all of my dreams would come true if I did as she asked of me. You can guess fine well what happened next. I became intimately familiar with every inch of her body. Just like she promised, my dreams came true. The business merger I'd been working on went in my favour without me having done any of the paperwork, and every morning I awoke to find her still at my side. Wealth seemed to fall in my lap, and my rivals encountered unfortunate circumstances at every turn. Life seemed perfect. Until a week later, when I heard the news that my brother had died. Like the others, he died with a look of horror on his face. This had been nagging at me for some time, but every time I wanted to give it some thought, she was there, seemingly more desirable than before, and my mind wandered. I could barely mourn before she had me flat on my back again without the thought in the world that wasn't to do with her. Where my business succeeded, my personal life took blow after blow. It seemed every week another member of the family perished. I threw myself further into my work to block out my feelings of grief and let her increasingly soothe my sorrows with her indescribable nightly charms. Without my realising, there was only my father left. I was his last familiar face in the world. He had descended into a sort of insanity at the complete and utter devastation of his family. "I'll be next, son," he said to me. His hair had turned white almost overnight. There was a wild look in his eyes, and at the time I couldn't take him seriously. He sounded like no more than another crazed man walking the streets preaching about the coming end times. Don't worry, Father. You're safe. I have men watching you every second of the day. I won't let the last of my blood perish to whatever foul curse has befallen our family. My father then descended into babbling and I left him. It was the last time I saw him. After the funeral, which had become almost a weekly occurrence to me, like a Sunday roast, she was there to console me. Despite the circumstances, she seemed insistent on getting me home. The sacred place where I thought we had lived happily for the past few years, the sanctuary where nothing could hurt me. And yet, doubt was creeping in. What was happening to my family? I'd consulted almost everyone I could think of. Doctors, scientists, priests, even an exorcist. None of them could help. As a last resort, I called on a demonologist. At her insistence, I telegraphed him and asked if he'd arrive a week later. I needed a rest, she crooned. I should have realised then what was going on, but at the sight of her, my mind would go numb with lust. Not an hour after my father, my last living relative, was in the ground, she had me in bed for the most prolonged, passionate night of my life. With that act, I had signed my life away. When the dawn came, to my deepest regret, her true form was revealed to me at last. Such a foul mistake I had made. I was naked and laid bare, so was she. Although she took more pleasure from that scene than I did, my mind couldn't fathom the truth of what I was seeing. "What foul creature are you?" I cried. But as she unfurled her bat-like wings and her face contorted into a bestial snarl, I already knew the answer. Her cry of cruel laughter as her wings carried her away has haunted my every waking moment since. From that moment on, I was filled with grief and despair. I'd cursed my family in exchange for fleeting pleasures. The last thing every single one of my relatives saw, down to the youngest child, was her hellish, true form and eyes full of bloodlust. Soon after, they were found dead, their hearts ripped from their chests and a look of terror on their faces. I had doomed them all, and now she's coming for me, the last of my line. It's been a year to the day that I foolishly threw away my life by giving her my body and taking pleasure from hers. I don't know what fate awaits me, and I dread to think on it. How many other foolish men will meet my fate? My accomplishments seem so worthless now. She was the cause of them all. I had in truth achieved nothing. She has terrorised me constantly. Walking down the street, I would spot her among the crowd grinning at me. She would appear in many forms, some to fill me with desire, others to make me cry out in fear. "I've missed you," she'd whisper, with a grin that said nothing of the sort. "Drop your illusions, she-devil, and end your torment of me, I beg of her." "With pleasure," she said in the silkiest of tones. Those around me thought I was going mad. Maybe I was. No one else seemed to notice her standing there with those black wings and eyes burning red in which I could see all my life's sins reflected back at me. My business has failed. My wealth is gone. All I have left is this house. The staff are long gone, and the corridors are cold. I sit alone in the room of red and gold. I can hear her voice coming from beyond the door, along with the sound of scratching claws, terrible rustling wings, and a cackle that freezes my blood. I can already feel her claws tearing at my chest, and yet still, I desire her. This is the end, and I go gladly. Farewell. That was a lusty gothic tale from author R.T.Gillespie. Tune in again next week for another episode of Danica Raven's Bitesize Horror. We love all the artwork you've been sending into the show. If you have stories, music or artwork of your own, please get in contact as we'd love to showcase it.